Okay, so before we dive into our show today, we wanted to really heartily acknowledge that we are in this episode talking about the word trigger, specifically related to trauma and as a trauma response. And before we really dive into this, we wanted to just put it out there that neither of us are doctors, neither of us are psychologists, psychiatrists. We are not medical professionals, and we just wanted to say that for anyone who may be listening. The information we're discussing in this episode is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice. We are just talking about our own experiences with these things, situations we've experienced in our own therapy or recovery journeys. But if this is a topic that is important to you or something you feel like you are fully having your own experience with, we totally support and encourage you going to your own trusted medical professional with any questions or anything you might be going through.
Naturally, when we're talking about triggers, we may bring up some very uncomfortable topics that some people may not want to hear, topics that some people may be triggered by. So we just wanted to put out a fair warning that if this is something that's going to make you uncomfortable, feel free to not listen, to skip this episode. We made a list of everything that we're going to talk about. So Taylor is going to read over it really quick and just make sure that everyone is fair warned and prepared for what we're going to discuss in this episode.
Here we go. Full official content warning. In this episode, we touch on each of the following. Sometimes we discuss them a little bit more, but all of these things will be mentioned. So just want to give you a quick little rundown of that. In this episode, we touch on trauma, assault, war and combat, car crashes, deaths, divorce, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, eating disorders, rape, and police brutality. We know that there's a lot of heavy stuff going on in this episode. We're going to do our best to really treat this with absolutely as much respect as we can. And if this one's not for you, if you're feeling like you want to skip this just from this warning, we totally understand. But thank you. Thanks.
No hard
Thanks
feelings.
no hard feelings. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to Vibes Revealed,
a podcast dedicated to pulling back the veil around wellness with your hosts,
Taylor McKiska
and Jay Tollett.
We believe living well is for everyone,
and no topic is taboo. Join us on our journey as we redefine what it means to be truly well in a modern world.
We're celebrating everyday magic,
but always keeping it real.
Let's vibe. Okay, cool. We're back. Episode 4. Today we are talking about triggers.
Even the word is bringing.
I know.
Me.
It feels really scary. I don't know why. It feels like scary to me. It feels uncomfortable for me to even say it. Even when I was making that graphic yesterday and I was typing it, I was like, "Am I allowed to be typing this?" It doesn't. It feels like scary. It definitely feels scary to me. Yeah.
It feels scary. What I like about us selecting this topic, this was actually a suggestion from a podcast listener even before the podcast began. Actually, my friend was talking to me and she's like, you know what I think would be really cool for you and Taylor to cover in your podcast? And this was just after seeing the trailer. She was like, I feel like a lot of people say trigger right now and they mean it to mean like I'm annoyed or I'm irritated. And she's like, that's not really what it is. And maybe we should talk about that. And I was like, oh, guilty, literally guilty. I also speak about trigger in the correct terminology when the terminology is appropriate, but I'll be the first to admit that I will say that I was triggered by some really stupid, trivial shit that didn't actually trigger me. So that's, once again, us confronting our own usage of the stuff that we're covering and how language really is misused and how that doesn't serve the greater good of the collective of all of us to use those words inappropriately. So here I am owning up to the fact that I have used trigger inappropriately in the past. And ever since we decided on doing this episode, I've been much more cognizant of the way I use the word and also my triggers themselves. And I'm like, oh gosh, because the conversation is deep and heavy. We will go.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Before we get too deep into it, to kind of just like ease us in, I wanted to ask you, instead of how are you, I wanted to ask, what's in your orbit this week? Like, what do you feel like is, and I, proud moment, I came up with that question on my own. It actually came to me in a meditation. But
That is amazing.
thank you. Yeah. And it kind of has the same feeling as like what's the vibe, but I feel like it's a little different because what's the vibe is something that like you choose, that you're like, oh, I'm into this, I'm learning more about it, or I'm engaging in it really actively. But I feel like what's in your orbit is a little more just like what has been kind of floating around you, or have you experienced any synchronicities or seen thematic things happening?
Wow, what's in my orbit? I really like that question. By the way, I played We Aren't Really Strangers last night with my friend, and it's a fun game. I was like, I'm into this. It's a really good game.
Fun.
Um, but I also like what's in your orbit as a question coming from you, because I immediately think of astrology, and then I made myself the sun, of course. I put myself in
Yes.
the middle of everything and I said, what's orbiting around me right now? And I actually, I guess this is going to be a shout out to another woman in the healthcare space who fully got me with marketing this week. And that is Michelle, founder of Holisticism, got me with her email funnel. I have never been so engaged in a 14-day email journey as I have been signing up to her 14 days to psychic superpowers. And literally, it's because she emails you every day and gives you a question to ask the Akashic Records. And so
Mm.
when you're asking yourself a question every day and like meditating on it, it sets the tone for your day. So her emails have literally set the tone for my last 2 weeks. And I just got to say, hats off. No one has ever gotten me with emails before. I'm the one who's like, get the quiz, thanks, I'm unsubscribing immediately. And this time around, I was really engaged in her. She's funny. And the questions were like, I'm really personally a fan of somebody giving me questions to ask my intuition, because I'm asking the same shit for like months at a time and I'm like bored of myself. That's why I really loved your tarot journey too, because I was like, ooh, new questions that I wouldn't usually ask. But I think it's gotten me back into journaling, and it's got me back into
Mm.
like just getting curious about myself. And so yeah, I've been orbiting around Holisticism's email funnel.
I love
That's
that.
orbiting around me, I should say.
Yeah. Shout out holisticism. I'm actually taking notes this time for things that we're going to put in the show notes because, uh,
You haven't shown up
oh
it.
my gosh, when I was listening back, I was like, oops,
That's not
that's
in there.
that's not in the show notes. So I'm taking notes this time of anything we mention. Promise, promise, promise. We'll put it in the show notes.
I love it.
Yeah, so we'll put a little link to Holisticism's. I'm actually going to throw in a link to Holisticism's website because it is a gem. There is tons of free content to engage in.
So
Really, really lovely. Thanks, Holisticism. I used
thank
your
you.
your email list workshop too. It's amazing.
It's so
You know? Yeah, it's so good. It's so good.
good. So
So
good.
expect my email list. Expect our email list coming soon.
What's in your orbit, Tay?
Um, in my orbit this week is ancestry. And I definitely think we could do an entire episode about ancestry. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. I signed up for an ancestry.com account a long time ago. I did one of those like holiday specials. I know very, very little about my ancestral line. And I thought a few years ago that that would be a way for me to connect to it, especially as I was developing my magic practices. I wanted to be very aware and engaged in practices that were of my culture, but I didn't know my culture at all. And even after doing that, I still don't really feel like I know my culture or I know my ancestry or I know much about my ancestral line at all. So I've been trying to better understand it. And it's really interesting to be in a place where like I am certain that my ancestors have caused harm and were colonizers at some point in my ancestral line. You know, they came here from somewhere else. And I don't think I can say, like maybe they were refugees of some sort, but I don't know. There's not really, I have no sort of like, this is where they came from. So my guess is that they're colonizers. But Sonia Renee Taylor posted a video this week about that it's everyone's job is to heal your ancestral line, heal your ancestral trauma. And I feel especially responsible for that, feeling like, if my ancestors did cause harm and that's something I'm aware of, and it's coming up for me, it's very much in my orbit that I keep seeing ancestors and ancestry. And I was getting a notification on my ancestry account that was like, more ancestors have been discovered for you. So I feel like it kept popping up this week, and I felt very much re-engaged with that, like what she was talking about, like it's my job to heal my ancestral line.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been exploring that a little bit this week, and as we talk about triggers and trauma, lots has come up for me around that, but I feel definitely responsible and committed to doing that work.
I love that.
Thanks.
I think, yeah, the healing ancestral trauma is work that we're all doing. And especially at this time, there's no getting out of it. Especially in America.
Yeah, there was like a really beautiful graphic floating around this week of like how many sets of ancestors it took to get to you, all the math of that. So it really made me think about that, like, wow, that is a huge line of ancestry, and I feel very disconnected from it. So I would like to feel more connected to it, and I'm just trying to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I love that.
All right, should we do our card of the convo? Yeah. Okay, cool. Card of the convo. So with our card of the convo, we're really just asking for something to ground into, I think, in this conversation, something we can refer back to throughout it, something that might set the tone for us. It's another reversal.
I knew it was going to be.
I knew it was going to be too. I don't think I've pulled an upright card in months, maybe. That's not true. I've definitely pulled a few of them. But okay, so today we are working with 5 of Pentacles reversed for our card of the convo.
I hate 5 of Pentacles.
Really?
The one time that I've ever felt good about 5 of Pentacles is when you spoke about it on your card of the tarot week. What is it called? Week of the tarot of the week?
I just do like Tarot Tuesday, card of the week.
Tarot Tuesdays. Wow, I really was just completely brain lapsing on that. Yes, on Tarot Tuesday. And when you gave your description, I was like, oh, it changed my relationship with the card. But in previous times, it was a previous stalker card. As you know, I've moved on to 7 of Pentacles, but 5 of Pentacles, maybe like 2 years ago, was just like in my realm. And I felt like it was just like saying that I was just like Povo. It's just like you were destitute. And I was like, I recognize this. Thank you. But you have a better way of going about it.
The thing that I'm really getting about this card, especially as we're diving into such a heavy topic today, it's really like you've got to come up for air sometimes, and in 5 of Pentacles, earth, it's grounded, it's rooted, right? In that reversal, it's really being like in a really heavy time when you might be feeling a lot of lack, when you might be feeling a lot of like when you're feeling a little bottom of the barrel, when you're feeling hopeless, there's got to be a moment to come up for air. And wherever you can find some levity to really take advantage of that. And in 5 of Pentacles reversed, there's also this sort of thing. Talk about being aware of your trauma. I said this when I talked about it in Tarot Tuesday. There's this feeling of like, okay, so I know what could go wrong about this. If I'm aware of a painful place, if I'm aware of the things that make me feel totally empty, how can I re-engage with that awareness? How can I re-engage with the rest of the world and keep that awareness of like sometimes things are going to be not great, I think that's definitely the main thing I'm getting from this. So even as for the two of us, as we go into this heavy conversation today, we'll remind ourselves to come up for air, that as we're discussing trauma and triggers, that we can still have moments of levity throughout this conversation. We can still find moments to connect with each other and to laugh and to talk about how we got through things.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
feel like it's an invitation for like recovery.
Yes,
You know, and
absolutely.
this is coming off the end of our conversation about shadow work, and a lot of the shadow work conversation was about examining our responses to triggering events and seeing, and just the awareness of that being a catalyst for us to be able to experience something different, hopefully.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Before we started this conversation, you were giving me such a lovely sort of definition.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I think the most important thing that I wanted to touch on is that we cannot have a conversation about triggers without discussing trauma and the embodiment of our emotional experiences. Embodiment, somatic experience as a means to house trauma. And that's where triggers come into play. I feel like my definition of trigger is an inciting incident or event or essence that causes our body to engage in a learned somatic response and an embodied response that we have to a past traumatic event. But I was listening to this talk by a psychologist at a summit that I attended last week, and she had said in her talk that trauma is not a thing of the past, though we talk about it as, you know, like a past traumatic event. She's like, it's a thing of the here and now. So when we think of being triggered, a lot of times I feel like we're thinking, why is this still affecting me? Why do I still have this response every time I hear this word or I smell this word? And we tend to have this feeling that something's wrong with us. Like, why am I reacting in this way? But the way she explained it is that when trauma occurs, there's just an overwhelming experience of energy in the body. And usually it's frightening or destabilizing. So that tells us that trauma isn't actually about the event, it's about the stimulation from that event and like what happens inside our bodies as a result of that stimulation. So if we're lucky, we have a traumatic event, we're able to hash it out, talk it through, do something about it immediately, and the feeling of that goes away. But if we're not so lucky, or if we have a past history of trauma, that energy, that overwhelming amount of energy gets stored in our bodies, and then it gets reactivated by triggers every time something that reminds us of this traumatic event pops up. And that could be a smell, it could be the look of a tattoo that you saw on a man that was assaulting you, it can be, you know, rolling hills, and you have a traumatic memory of rolling hills from your childhood. Anything can bring up the embodied response that you have to a traumatic event, and that brings it right back into the present. So triggers are kind of bringing past traumas into our present moment by activating something in our body that is hardwired to respond to that trigger in that way.
I think that was very, yeah, I think that was super well said though, because as we were also talking about this before we started the episode, a lot of the ways we're hearing it now is sort of as a replacement for something that irritated us.
Yeah.
We use it really often in this sort of like casual way. Right, exactly. Yeah, I guess we can just dive into this now. I think I was planning on saving it for a little later, but I had started seeing some stuff pop up on Instagram about like why you shouldn't use the word triggered, and sort of saying that it should be saved for certain people, certain moments, and that the original use for the word was in reference to a PTSD response. And PTSD, I found out, is actually much more common than I would have guessed. And even though it in the 1910s, 1920s, PTSD was pretty much only used to talk about veterans' experience in war or in combat. We know now that trauma can occur in so many places, in so many situations. And I was really surprised to find out there are more than 300 million cases of PTSD diagnosed every year. I was like, that is a ton of people living with PTSD, which I was really surprised to find out. So I don't think it is, when I learned that and I learned how common it is, and also I don't think I could like deny anyone's traumatic experience. Like, if you feel like something was traumatic to you, who am I to say like, no, that wasn't, and you shouldn't use this word, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely, I think it became kind of popularized as more people started going to therapy, as more people started getting diagnosed. It sort of made its way out of therapy rooms and sessions and doctors' offices and into the digital space that we very much live in now.
Totally. I mean, I think we've touched on this. Like, in this day and age, everybody has anxiety. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's like it's that kind of thing where the mental health conversation, I mean, thank God it's becoming less taboo. But I think pop culture, when we talk about the misusage of the word trigger, people say like, but people
Mm-hmm.
are like, oh my God, he didn't text me back. I was totally triggered. Sure. Okay. So maybe you were triggered because he didn't text you back because you have fear of abandonment, because you were a neglected child. And that is fully a trigger response, you know? And a lot of people have those types of attachment responses in relationships where they respond a certain way because of their experience with their parents in their childhood. But then we get confused because to some of us, it is not traumatic to not get text back. You know, like we don't have that issue. And so then we just take on the definition of trauma as to say like, oh, I was annoyed. He ghosted me and I was annoyed. Some people can be responding to being ghosted as like, this is bringing up past trauma of when my ex, you know, left me and didn't call. I showed up and everything was gone from our house. Like, those are true stories of truly traumatic events that happen in people's lives. But when we're not talking about the real usage of the word, we just get confused and we think it means, oh, I was totally annoyed that loser ghosted me. And
Yeah.
so it gets murky, you know, because I think, who are we to judge another man's trauma, another woman's trauma, another human's trauma? You know, like,
Right.
you never know. But unless we're ready to get like down and vulnerable and just like fully open, which we kind of do on social media, still it will require way oversharing to get to the point where like trauma could be adequately assessed by the next man, you know?
Right. I think social media is a really interesting place to be having a conversation around trauma. And I do think it happens really often that even if someone doesn't mean to, it's very easy to be like, that's not trauma,
Oh
you
yeah.
know?
Let's talk big T, little t trauma.
Yes, yes, please. This has also been, even just in preparation for this conversation, it has been so like confronting for me to realize how much of my own trauma that I do that to myself, that I'm like, that's not trauma.
Yeah.
And that I feel uncomfortable even saying the words, that I feel uncomfortable even saying the words like trauma and trigger, because I'm like, those aren't mine to use. That's not me. But like, it very well could be me. And I'm definitely have some trauma that
Fully
needs to
have
be
trauma.
healed. Yeah. But
I'm not trying
please,
to
if
call you
you,
out.
oh no, for sure. But yeah, I
But it's
definitely
like,
do.
even some of the
Everybody
stories
does.
that I know, I'm like, that's trauma. That is trauma.
But yeah, if you would walk us through big T, little t trauma.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's do the disclaimer thing where I say I did not study psychology. I am not an expert. This is just from my learnings and from what I understand of it. But I think a lot of us tend to think of trauma as majorly traumatic events like war, which is exactly what you were saying about how we used to only think of PTSD in terms of veterans and wartime experiences. But major car crashes where you see your parent pass away in front of you, or even parents getting divorced is often cited as very traumatic for young children. You know, like big accidents, deaths, those are like big T trauma, the type of thing where objectively someone looks at it and says, oh, that was a traumatic event in your life. And then there's other things to us may from the outside look smaller, but for someone else it was traumatic. And that could be something like being bullied in school. And it definitely depends on what type of home environment you're going home to. If you don't belong in school and you're ridiculed, and then you come home and you're held and you're safe and you're loved, then that bullying experience is not going to be the same trauma for you as it's going to be for the kid who goes to school, gets bullied, and comes home and gets bullied in their own home. And then they have no place. And to them, it's so much bigger, you know. And we can't always be the measure of like how someone's going to find resilience against something like being bullied. I can think of a couple times when I got called weird names. My last name's Tolette. People used to call me Toilet, and that brushed right off my shoulder. But for someone else, that could be very traumatic. Could bring shame around your name, which is like the thing that's literally attached to you until death. But just little things that you think are small, but to you they're big. And to you, they shift the way that you carry on living your life. And I think that's a really important discussion when it comes to speaking about triggers, because at some point in your life, even if it's a little T trauma, even if someone just said, "Oh, you don't really look that cute in that dress." From that day on, when you were 9 years old, someone told you that you didn't look cute in a short dress forevermore. You thought, I'm not the type of person who looks good in short dresses. I'm not comfortable wearing short dresses. I don't want to wear short dresses. That is trauma. And for someone, it was a passing comment. They weren't even talking about short dresses. They were just mentioning that one dress. But for you, it stuck with you for the rest of your life. And now you carry this idea, this belief in you that you don't look good in short dresses. And every time someone says, a wedding's coming up and you're a bridesmaid and you're expected to wear a short dress and you have a meltdown. Every time it's summer, it's hot and like you're too hot out, but you still want to wear pants because you're scared of, that's trauma. But to the one looking on, they're just like, the one thing that I said to you that I don't remember that I said in 1997 really affected you for the rest of your life. But that's why triggers are so intense, because for that person, now they're triggered by the sight of a short dress. And that thing that pops up everywhere. You see your friends wearing them, you see them in magazines, on models, and you're triggered for the rest of your life. And that's hard. But I think the work around triggers is recognizing that that thing that was said in the past isn't putting your life in danger, isn't a threat to you. Your body stores it as a threat. Your body says, this was something threatening that happened to me, and now I'll do everything in my power not to put myself in danger again. But our bodies aren't really good at recognizing the difference between like the danger of harsh words and the danger of like an oncoming tiger or a falling building. You know, we kind of store it all the same. And that's why triggers can be so scary, because it's our body responding to the threat of some things that are just not quite threatening, but to us, they feel threatening.
Yeah.
I went off topic. I went on a tangent. I was talking
That was
about
great.
little T trauma, but I think I got the point across.
Yeah, I do. I really think it keeps going back to that point of like, as just an onlooker, as a person observing another person, it's really not up to me to say what is big T, little T trauma for someone else.
Yeah.
Because
And
like we're
honestly,
all working with different levels of
yeah,
trauma
it's a
and things.
spectrum.
Absolutely. Just
A
like
spectrum of trauma. It's not even big T, little T.
totally.
It's like the scale of fonts, like from size 8 all the way up to size 144 or whatever. But that's why even what you were seeing on Instagram that was saying these people don't have the right to say triggered. It's like, yes, there are some people using it incorrectly, but how do you know they don't have the right? We could all have post-traumatic stress. Pretty much everyone has had some type of traumatic event in their childhood, you know?
Well, and even like this moment right now, I think to say like, I think we are experiencing collective trauma in this moment from the pandemic,
Yeah.
from having, violence so accessible. And sometimes you don't even know you're about to see an incredibly violent video, pop up and you're like, oh my gosh, that was something I never would have chosen to see.
Ooh.
Especially being so hyper connected to our devices, we're experiencing what you were talking about before. We're experiencing trauma in real time. It's not like it's something from our past. It's like it's happening right now. And right now, I think we're experiencing a collective trauma unlike anything I've experienced in my lifetime up to this point. Maybe someone who's in their 90s is like, yes, I experienced something similar to this when I was your age, but I definitely think that it's something we're being confronted with really every day. So to say who can use it and who can't is kind of like, well, at this point, we're all exposed, you know? I think it's just kind of going back to the whole point of this podcast is we're just like, we want to be aware of how we're using it and what we're saying and what we're talking about when we use the word triggered and when we use the word trauma.
I think what you were saying earlier was a good segue into like how we're so bombarded on social media and not knowing what we're going to see. And something that has been popping up just in terms of being respectful of all people and being aware of the full spectrum of human experience, talking about trigger warnings.
Yes.
And it should be a requirement. It should fully be a requirement that if you're going to talk about obviously traumatic things, eating disorders, rape, war, if you're going to see murder and violence in a video, all of these should come with trigger warnings. Like people put TW : at the beginning of their post, trigger warning, going to talk about rape in this post, just letting you know, and that's really important because what we have access to on social media, on the internet, like we don't necessarily want to be confronting those things all the time, and some of us are not emotionally prepared to be confronting those things because of trauma that we've experienced in our past. So to give that warning is one of the ways of being cognizant about what's going on in other people's experience and saying, hey, I don't own the rights to big T, little t trauma. If I'm going to talk about a car crash in my post, it's going to get a trigger warning in the beginning because someone might have lost a parent in a car crash. Someone might have seen unthinkable things in car crashes because that's what happens. So just being cognizant of that and preparing people for how we're going to share information. Even if you're going to share, like when the video of George Floyd was going around, please put a trigger warning. It was very hard to see. And I think a lot of people felt the need to share images of that over and over again as a way of saying we need justice. But I'm like, we need to, like, especially in the Black community, don't just like send random pictures of someone being killed to your friend thinking, oh my God, this is so sad. What can I do for you? I'm like, not send me those pictures. I've seen it. I saw it once. Thank you. Like, it's irreverent to be sharing all of this really explicit, graphic, heavy content without warning people of it.
Yeah, that is a big conversation I've seen happening on social media this week is we don't need to watch another video of a Black person being murdered to validate or activate revolution. There are so many ways that revolution can be activated and validated. And I think watching someone die or watching someone be seriously injured, watching someone be shot or harmed in any way is just like not the way.
Yeah.
That's just even talking about trigger it feels hard to say and hard to talk about because of that association with the origin of the word, which was from guns. And guns are something that I'm just like, I don't want to even acknowledge sometimes that they exist. Obviously I have to, because it's like, I feel like gun violence is like, it's like a plague in America particularly, and the police brutality, and it feels like such a just terribly heavy, awful thing. And I feel like so much, I just wish that I could change something about it. But it's hard. I also think that it is like a collective trauma where to have to witness it so often, to see it, to know that it is still so prevalent, to know that it's like even when people are asking for police to be removed from schools and things, like in LA there were rallies for days and it still didn't happen.
Yeah,
it's a collective thing to keep living through that and knowing that like your ask wasn't answered, it wasn't even acknowledged, there's still violence going on every single day, and it gets to feel really defeating. Like, what can we do?
oh my gosh, yeah. And that's exactly how this works in psychology. It's our bodies have self-protective responses. In order to respond to trauma, something must be done in that moment. Like when we say, hey, I'm having a traumatic event, and we go to when we're young, it's our parents, but maybe it's to our partner, or maybe it's to our local officials. And we say, I'm experiencing trauma. Please help me through this. And we're expected to be offered safety or a way through it. And when we're not, that's when the traumatic energy gets stuck and stored in our bodies. And then whenever we re-experience something that reminds us of that trauma, we are triggered. And that's kind of like on this collective level, the fact that the government isn't responding to the atrocity going on is putting us in this state of being perpetually triggered by the people who are supposed to keep us safe, who have chosen not to keep us safe. And now any action feels unsafe in this climate. And that is a lot of what trigger is about. The idea of that your emotional state is a loaded gun, and that any seemingly small thing can come and pull the trigger on that and let out that intense overwhelm of emotional energy that's stored and stuck somewhere in your body, and it comes out and you're not prepared to manage it. And that's kind of like what we were talking about in the shadow work episode, where it comes out in wild and unruly ways. You have a lash out of anger, or you burst into tears, or you go catatonic and you literally don't speak, don't move, and that's one of the body's like most primal responses. Like if you've ever seen a bird fly into a clear window and then it just flacks back on the ground and you think it's dead, but really it thought that it hit a threat. So it just the body plays dead, because it's like, I have nothing to do. I've already come in contact with this dangerous thing. All I can do is just not move and hope that everything's fine. And then slowly the bird starts to twitch and wake back up. And that's literally one of the body's most natural responses to a traumatic event, is to just be dead, and that's what humans do. Humans, sometimes have a response of being like, if I don't say anything, if I don't do anything, I can stay safe inside my own head. And that is a very natural human response. And sometimes that's what we do. We can't even judge people for having that response, because that is just a human response to trauma that is not being accurately addressed, and then being stored, and then being triggered on a consistent basis, just by notion of the fact that we exist, which is tough. So like, when do we bring some recovery in and like have a laugh?
I know. Oh, I did, before we get into, because I was hoping we could talk about sort of what we do to move through our responses, to move through our bodily responses. But before we do, I did want to talk a little bit about the history of the word trigger, because I think that it's really interesting and I think it gives us a lot of context. And also to touch back on what you were talking about with trigger warnings, which I think as of late have become kind of popularized as content warnings instead of trigger warnings.
Yeah.
Because even the word trigger is hard to say. So content warning has become kind of the thing that we use instead. But that's actually where this article came from. There was a lot of debate over content warnings being a violation of free speech, which I am so over, and we might get some hate for this, but I am just so over the like bullshit. Like, I'm so over it. But I don't know. When I was reading it, I was like, oh, no one's infringing on your right to freedom of speech by providing a content warning.
That's where I'm like, I wish we could all, like, this has been coming up. What's been in my orbit actually is the doctor's oath to do no harm. And I was like, why can't we just all take an oath when we turn 18 to do no harm? Because people seem to think that like tied up in their freedom of speech and freedom of the religion and freedom of all those freedoms, they have the right to like do harm with said freedom. And I'm like, if you're out here doing harm, your freedom pass is revoked. Like, if you literally can't warn someone that they're about to see death, you think that's an infringement on your freedom of speech, then you are a dangerous person. So
1,000%.
like, I would like you out of my orbit, please. But like, I'm just so confused as to why people think that they like have the freedom to do harm. That seems to be like one of the core freedoms that they think they have wrapped up in this, like, because the freedom of speech thing is it's murky. because like
Mhm.
we're talking about speaking on the internet, like there's actually laws against like libel and
Mhm.
false information. You know, like there's
Right.
there's some things that aren't actually legal. There are rules like TVMA. Is that an infringement on someone's freedom of speech because you warned people that it's
Yeah.
only for mature adults? No. So it's like, why do you think that you shouldn't have to put a content warning because suddenly you've become your own personal TV broadcasting thing? The areas of social media have just made content so murky because it used to just be TV. And sure as
Yeah.
hell, they would not let you say some harmful shit on NBC7. You know what I mean? Like, they'd be like, no, you're not allowed to say that. And bleep, 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 censored. And no one ever went up in arms about that.
Yeah.
Like, no one's mad that you can't say fuck on TV.
Right.
I mean, I'm mad about it, but I keep it apart. But like, people aren't out here being like, my free speech has been infringed. But now, like, we're not required to warn people that they're literally about to watch a murder.
Yeah, I'm going to get into the history a bit of how trigger became a colloquial term that we use. So, actually the first use of the word trigger in the dictionary happened in 1621. So, this is not new. It was in reference to guns. It became the common word for that piece on a gun in the 1700s. So that's really when it was like widely accepted that that's what everybody called it. And so that's in the 1700s. And then it didn't come up again until World War One with the rise of PTSD in soldiers. Trigger became the term used to speak to trauma responses.
And was it in relation to the gun? They were like, oh, it's like the trauma response is the loaded gun.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly. So psychiatrists, psychologists started using the term in reference to PTSD in the 1910s, 1920s. And then it wasn't until the rise of the internet that it became sort of what we use it as today. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. It started popping up a lot between 2006 and 2008 as Twitter became very popular and Tumblr became very popular. And I will say, like, yeah, there was some wild shit on Tumblr, but also shout out Tumblr. I feel like Tumblr was where I learned so many things. That was definitely the first place that I saw the word trigger. And that was definitely the first place I saw like a trigger warning, a content warning was on Tumblr back when I was like 13. So,
Tumblr was
um,
like the TikTok of like the early
oh
2000s.
my gosh, I loved Tumblr. Lots of take it or leave it information, but I definitely learned a lot. So that was the first place I saw trigger. And in 2013, it started becoming widely requested by the public, by people who were watching TV, especially with shows like Game of Thrones that showed a lot of really graphic violence, sexual violence, harassment, things like that. As that became more popular on TV, people started asking for trigger warnings at the beginning of episodes, content warnings. That's where it really sort of became super, super mainstream, was when it would be put at the start of a show, like, here's a
Mm.
trigger warning, this is what's going to be happening in this episode.
Oh.
So that was 2013 was the first time that it was like on TV as a trigger warning, which I thought was really interesting. And that was how it became like a household word. Yeah.
Totally. I don't remember ever saying that I felt triggered before that. I'm trying to think of moments where I use the word trigger inappropriately, but then I do realize that I often use it in response to my trauma.
Yeah. You know where I hear it? Well, it's really interesting. My little sisters are like very Gen Z. They're like you could not be more Gen Z than, and they're at the like end of Gen Z. They're really young. They're 12 and 13. But I hear them say it. Like when I was visiting them at home, they say it almost as like it's an insult to each other. Like when one of them gets upset, the other one will be like, "Ooh, triggered." And I'm like, "Where did you learn this?"
Oh my gosh, the problem is with the youth.
Isn't it always?
It so is. People thought millennials were bad, and I'm like, pray for Gen Z, y'all. It's
Oh,
really bad out there.
I do. I love Gen Z though, and it's so funny. Like even when I read those articles of Gen Z like talking so much shit on millennials, where they're like, "Oh, millennials think avocado toast is a personality." I'm like, "Oh, you're right." Like,
I think there's something really special about Gen Z, and I think, I don't know, it's hard to talk about them because there's like part of them that like really has like a lot of heart and who are trying to return back to like the goodness of humanity. And then
Hmm.
part of them are so conditioned by social media, by just like living inside a phone from the second they were born. Like it's like the first generation who really didn't have that gap between like being independent and having a phone and like a smartphone, I should say, and then not. It's just like the smartphones, like I've seen 1-year-old babies who know how to swipe an iPhone open. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what's happening here? You know, like they're, so I think like part of them are really in trouble, but then that exposure, that overexposure to everything in the world actually makes them like better at heart. And I think
Yeah.
like, especially like the early 20s right now, the people that are in their early 20s, I'm like, wow, you might all change the world. Like I have a
Totally.
couple of friends who are like 20 and I'm like, the shit you are thinking about right now was not on my mind until after 25, really.
For
Like they're really
sure.
just like thinking in different ways, and I think they're a little more exposed to like spirituality and just like oneness, universal oneness is kind of their game. So I shit on them, but only because I'm not one of them.
Yeah, when I sometimes and I will say this, and I think this is very true of Gen Z. So if I said to my sisters though, hey, that's not really like the best use of the word triggered, they'd be like, oh, okay, what is? And they would be genuinely curious and they would want to learn about it, and then they would want to use it the right way or use it the way that it was meant to be used. Yeah, I feel like
Very
Gen Z is
socially conscious.
totally. And they're really willing to be like, oh, I was wrong. I'm gonna do this differently. I'm fully willing to learn. And I also feel like a big Gen Z thing is like they really just want people to like be comfortable and feel good. So like they'll if it's like, oh cool, if it makes you comfortable, like yeah, I'm down for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally seeing Gen Z kind of grow up. I used to nanny for twins too that are like very Gen Z. They're in their 20s, they're in their very early 20s. They're actually just 20, they're 20 years old. Um, and when I'm around them, I feel old in that I'm like, oh, you're so cool. Like, this is what it means to be cool. And I feel like I just completely squandered my 20s, like feeling so not cool. But like, I promise you, if you are 20 years old and you're listening to this, you are so cool. Don't doubt it. You're super
You still
cool.
have time left in your 20s, Tay. You have the best years left.
You think? Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, Saturn return years? I
Yeah,
hope
those are
these are the best years.
formative. Formative. They're like the hardest years, but they're like the only time where I was like, okay, I was a reasonable human. I mean, like it was a bad time in my life, but I was like, I was doing human things.
Part of me wonders like will there ever stop being formative years, but I don't think there will. I think I'll be like 95 and I'll be like these are the most formative years of my life. Like getting old is weird, but I also don't feel like I'm getting old, and truthfully I really look forward to it. And when I think about childhood, I'm like, oh, you cannot pay me all the money in the world to go back and be a kid again.
You could
I
not pay
would
money
never
to go back to high school.
talk about triggering experiences. When someone even mentions high school, I'm like, ugh, oh no, thank you, pass.
I mean, for me, like I had no problem at the time, but now when I think back to high school and I realize how many of my beliefs about myself and my patterns were originated there, I'm like, ooh, that was not a good time for me. And I didn't even see it. I thought I was living large. I was like popular or whatever you want to call it. I went to a private school and there were 100 people in my class. So insofar as you can be like cool, I was pretty cool. I had like a cool group of friends, and there was some shit. I mean, first of all, it was racist as fuck. Just like I think I was the only black person in my entire high school. And then, not in my entire high school, my entire middle school. And then a black girl came my freshman year of high school. No, really, like really, you could count on your hands the people of color that went to my high school. And it was traumatic.
Yeah.
It was traumatic, and I didn't realize that it was traumatic until much later. And then my friends were planning the 10-year reunion. My friends from high school were planning the 10-year reunion, and I was like, I realized I was like, I can't go back there. And they were pissed. I mean, I think our relationship hasn't been the same since I didn't go. I think they really assumed that like my feelings about my experience in high school was somehow a reflection of them, and it wasn't. But I mean, our relationships fell apart after that moment. I didn't go to the high school reunion, and I don't think we were ever friends again. And I mean, that's something that was actually really traumatic for me in my late 20s. Like that, we've talked about this. That's something that like took me a long time to grapple with, the fact that I had lost so many friends all at once. And it had happened like in the wake of my dad passing away, and things were never really explained. There was no closure, whatever you want to call that. And it was just really hard. And I'm finally getting, I'm not going to say that I'm over it. It's still sad to me, but like I feel differently about it than I did. And I think this goes back to the conversation we were having on the shadow work episode, where I do have something in me that thinks that I'm not a good friend, and it's because of that experience. And I'm like trying to shake it, because I'm like, Jay, you are a good person, you are a good friend. But like the last 3 years of my 20s were like me asking myself, am I a good person? Am I a good friend? Am I worthy of friendship? And the answers weren't coming in so clear. So that was a hard time for me. But I think I'm through it. I think I'm in the last like tastes of my Saturn return. I'm like,
You definitely are.
it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's an experience.
Yeah. Well, I know it doesn't heal the past, but you are such a good friend to me. And I'm so grateful for your friendship. I cannot imagine not having you as my friend. So
I love you.
I love you. Thanks for sharing that.
That was light.
Yeah.
It wasn't light.
Yeah.
But that last sweet moment of friendship was really light.
I'm glad we got to share that. Do we want to talk a little bit about how we recognize or move through when we are confronted with a triggering experience?
Yeah. Do you want to go on that first?
Yeah, I will. So I've been a barista, I've worked at front desks, I've worked in clothing stores, all of that, you know? And when I worked at a very fancy gym, I worked at the front desk there, and I dealt with just like a barrage of angry old men every day. I always worked opening shift, and it would be like, call me a bitch and like be like, just fix this. And I'm like, I am literally a front desk girl. I do not know why you think I can like change the parking garage. I know this sounds like just the lamest thing in the world to do, but I would just literally like take a deep breath and try to like, because it was like my body was like, this man is about to like, 1, touch you, 2, call you a bitch, 3, be very demanding of your time and attention. Don't really want to engage in any of those things. But I would usually like take a deep breath, and then I would go grab someone else to be on the floor with me. And I know that it's not always available that you can like phone a friend, but that would always really help like lower my nerves around it and like calm my nervous system if I knew that there was someone else who was in my same position who worked with me, that I could at least like balance that interaction with.
So, how I respond to triggers.
So, yeah, okay. Recognizing it, I just try to look at when my reactions are disproportionate to the event that happened. So, a lot of times for me, it will be little things that set me off, and I'm like, wait, how did this happen? How did I go from being fine to angry in just a split second from like that small sentence? So I think it's helpful for me to call that out, because sometimes you just have a reaction and you think it's normal because you're in the moment and you're like, this is my reaction, this is how I react. But sometimes it's helpful for me to be like, wait, that reaction was largely disproportionate to the event. I don't actually care about what that person just said. So why did my body react in that way? And it's helpful, because then you know that's your embodied response and not necessarily how you actually feel or what's going on mentally for you. Then after that, you kind of just want to see if you can get to the underlying root, and that involves sometimes talking to people that you're close with, sometimes journaling things out. But I think then the next step is really getting those stuck emotions out of your body. And that's, for me, always through some form of like exercise. I love doing yoga. Also just breathing, like deep belly breathing. Someone will set me off and I will literally be like, I'll close my eyes and like take 3 very deep breaths. And they know I'm mad when I do that, but at least it calms me down and it allows me to like chill for a second and just like kind of breathe that out of my body.
Yeah, a thing that really helps me when I feel confronted is having someone just really simply validate my experience. I think especially if you have ever been with a partner or a family member who loves to throw around the phrase, you're crazy, which I definitely have that experience of someone being like, you're crazy. That's crazy that you feel that way. So a lot of times I know that my emotional responses, or I feel that my emotional responses are already too much. And I'm like, no, that's crazy. I'm crazy. So it really helps me to just have someone else validate that experience, even if they don't necessarily agree with my emotional response. If they're just like, I totally see why you felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if they don't say anything at all and just listen to me talk through the whole thing, it helps me a lot to process, to actually talk through things out loud, through things out loud with literally anybody at all. I'm an enormous oversharer, which is like contradictory to my loving to keep secrets. But I also, as much as I love to keep secrets, just love to fully unload everything I've ever experienced in my life. So that's why I have a podcast. But yeah, it helps me a lot to talk through what happened, talk through what was really frustrating about it, talk through my emotional response. And if another emotional response comes up, to just let it flow, however that comes out once I'm like in the space for it, and to have someone else validate that for me. I know that it's another thing, like phoning a friend. You can't always have that external validation, but when I can, or when that's an option, that always feels really good.
And then I guess, I mean, scientifically, and if we're talking about psychology, there is the element of embodiment. And embodiment is something that we're going to have to cover on another episode completely, because that's just a whole world of language that we don't all necessarily understand, but making physical what was once emotional energy. And there are many ways to do this in psychotherapy, like EMDR, like I totally forget what it is, but it's a type of therapy where you create a space around you and you assign identities of people from triggering events onto objects in the space. So like that chair over there is my mother, and the giant lamp over there is my dad, because my dad was an overbearing person, and the lamp is overbearing in the space. And then you move things around you move the furniture around and have conversations with the furniture. I'm going to have to look up what this is called and put it in the show notes, but this is something that I read about in The Body Keeps the Score, which is that really intense book about trauma. But that is to say, making physical experiences out of things that have been replaying as emotional experiences in your life ever since whatever trauma you underwent. Even if it's something as small as stomping out your anger physically. Like if something makes you mad, just stomp or just growl and release anger in that way. Or what I like to do, which is more of an energetic practice, is a lot of times I feel anger like up in my head. So then I breathe in and I feel like my angry head is hot and filled with hot air. And then as I exhale, I just try to push the hot air down into lower areas of my body and just like get it out of my head, but ways to use your body and imagine things happening in your body and actually move your body to move energy around. Qigong is a Chinese practice where you literally are moving physical energy through your body with meditation and mindfulness. So there are a lot of practices that allow you to have an emotional experience, but let it be embodied as you do it. And that is super important for responding to triggers and responding to trauma, because like we said, trauma is in the here and now. And if you don't do something about it in the here and now, stomp your feet, yell, scream, jump up and down, release the energy will get stuck and it will stay and it will play on a loop until you let it out.
It's so funny for you to talk about that you feel energy in your head. I'm the same way. I feel everything really active around my like crown at the top of my head. But I love that you like send it down. What I do is I imagine a little hole opening at the top of my head, and I like let it, as if it is steam, like from a kettle, come out of the top of my head. until
Yes.
I feel like there is just no steam anymore. It's like a little, my Reiki teacher thinks it's like a blowhole, like what a dolphin has.
I was about to say you're like a whale. And I was
Yeah,
like,
like,
you're a water baby, so you are a
yeah,
whale.
of course. Yeah. So it's just like, it's like a little hole opens up in the top of my head. And then I just like release all the pent up energy, frustration, aggression, emotional response, as if it is like steam or water or, yeah, I just let it come right out of the top of my head.
I love that. I love how we always have opposite
I
responses.
know. I think it's so funny.
It's
Um,
great.
yeah. Okay, well, those are a few ways. If you're looking for some physical practices, if you're looking for maybe some sort of therapy practices, those are a few ways that might be helpful in responding to triggers and trauma responses.
I think that it definitely wants to be said that if you feel like you are reliving trauma in a really deep way, this is something that almost invariably must be done with a psychotherapist. This is not
Yeah.
something that you can talk yourself through, journal yourself through, meditate yourself through. A lot of PTSD is to be taken seriously. And based on the stats of how much PTSD there is, I'm assuming that there's that many people undiagnosed because they'd never step foot in any type of facility that would let them know that they had PTSD. So if you feel as if you're experiencing a lot of triggering events and returning to old trauma or returning to a space that you're not even quite sure of, because you may have blacked out the inciting trauma, like seek help, seek therapy, and seek someone who can truly take you through psychotherapy practices that will help you move through this. It can be really life-changing.
Yeah, definitely. And to follow up with that, we know that diagnosis and therapy is not super available to everyone. We will definitely do some work here to find some resources that can assist with cost of therapy, that can assist with working through some of these things. And when we find those, we will definitely let you know. And that is something that if you don't see us put it anywhere soon, totally feel free to hold us accountable. If you know of sources that have affordable therapy or have mental health programs that are super accessible, definitely let us know. I would love to know about that just so I can share it with anyone in my life who might be looking for something like that.
Yes.
Do we want to do what's the vibe?
Yes, we do.
Okay, can I ask you first?
Oh my God, I'm not prepared. Okay, yeah.
Okay, what's the vibe, Jay?
Oh my God. I mean, I basically almost want to say exactly what I said on the beginning of the call. And I know
That's
that I
okay.
have a different vibe. Oh my God. Actually, no, this is a serious vibe for me. It's Virgo season and I am making to-do lists. This is the third day in a row that I've made a to-do list. And for anyone out there who knows me, I am not a to-do list person. Even the act of having a to-do list usually gives me such an immense amount of stress that nothing can get done. Like most people are like, if you're stressed, make a to-do list and that will help organize your thoughts. And it's the exact opposite for me. But I felt like my energy was super scattered during Leo season. You saw, I was just really feeling like I was languishing. And then as soon as Virgo season hits, I'm like making to-do lists. On Monday, I made a to-do list and I did every single thing. I've
Yes.
never done that in my life. I've never made a to-do list and actually finished everything that was on the to-do list. Yesterday, I didn't finish all the things, but like I basically finished all the important things. And then there were like 2 things that like I didn't do because it just didn't happen. But I'm planning on doing them today. But I'm like, I'm gonna ride this wave. I hope it lasts for a while because like productive Jay is like on some other shit. And she's not usually around. So whenever she shows up, I'm like, gotta hang on to her. So that's the vibe this week, to-do lists.
I love that. I love Virgo season.
I know, it's good, right?
It's so good. It's so good. Shout out. Let us know if you're a Virgo.
Okay, what's the vibe, Tay?
My vibe is the book I'm currently reading, which I am so in love with. It's called Journey of Souls. And it is basically a case study book by this hypnotherapist whose name is escaping me. In the book, he's Dr. N. That's always how he refers to himself when he's working with patients. It's like Dr. N says, wait, it says it right here. Oh, Michael Newton is his name. That's the author. This book is also from like the 80s, but it's incredible. Basically, it talks about, he guides people through hypnotherapy into past life experiences in the space right after they die in a past life and what happens to their soul. And the session is all in the realm of the soul, which if you're like, this is way too woo for me, way too out there, reincarnation's not my jam, like this book is probably not for you. But if you're even a little bit curious as to how someone else may see it, the book is so fascinating to me. And I think the thing that is most fascinating to me is that throughout these case studies, all of the people in hypnosis talk about the experience of a human brain being just very like almost antithetical to a soul's experience. Like the human brain is sort of like this cap that they can't take off, that they're like, oh, why? And it also has been a really great reminder to me, because so often when I'm doing spiritual work, I think of everything as being sort of like above me. And I was really reminded that like my soul is incarnating in me, in my actual body right now. So when I'm doing this work of like talking to my higher self, I'm like, she's inside, babe. She's there. That's who you're talking to. Like, it's already in you. It's not above you anymore. It's like it came into this body, into this space, into Earth.
Yes.
So yeah, so that's actually been really fun. It's been so fun to read this book. I'm so fascinated by like all of these different soul experiences, and the language all of the patients use is so similar. And I know that like the doctor wrote this book so he could do whatever he wanted, but my gut feeling about it is that it's all pretty real stuff, that he was able to walk these people through these experiences. And it has just been such a ride to read. I've loved it.
It's on my Kindle.
Yay. I can't wait for you to read it.
I'm excited.
Yeah, you'll have to let me know what you think. It's so fun. I know that was such a like buzzwordy woo, way out there kind of thing, but
I mean, people are like, ooh, it's woo, but I'm like, woo is fun. Like,
yeah, it's fun. And I think
the word woo is like, woo.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing too, is I just kind of got into a space of like, yeah, it's fun. And when people want to like poo-poo on stuff like astrology and tarot, and they're like, it's not real, like, I don't care. Yeah, but there's tons of stuff that is not real that we love to believe in all the time. So these things are real to me. And I feel super grateful that my brain is a little more along for the journey and creates these images and puts things into language for me that I understand. And
I mean, I'm grateful for your brain too, because then you tell me some stuff and then I see it in my meditation and I'm like, I know this is Taylor's, but I'm appropriating it because it feels good.
But that's it. It's also like, I believe that our souls, like me and you, I'm like, our souls are so connected. Totally. Especially when I read this in this soul book, it talks about like your soul, you kind of have these like pods, and it's like, I so know that our souls are part of the same pod.
Yes.
And so like when I see something and I say it to you, your soul's like, oh yeah, you know,
yeah,
and it's able, yeah, it makes that connection right away, because it's like, we're on that soul vibe.
Vibing. We're on that wavelength together.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing.
I
did too. And really huge thank you to everyone who like went along on this conversation with us. We know that it was super heavy at points, and that it might have been uncomfortable, and there might have been things that have come up that made you feel like, oh, I don't like that, I don't want to engage in that. And I really, really have a lot of love and appreciation for anyone who listened all the way through to this. Thank you so much. If you have any feedback for us, please let us know. We're so open to that.
And let us know if there's some topics that came up that you want us to do an episode on. I think this was a cool episode because it was born out of someone asking us to talk about this. And this is not something that Taylor or I are experts in. We're not psychoanalysts. We don't have degrees in psychology, but it's something that interests us. And we realize that it's a very human experience. It's something that we all experience. So I also want to say thank you. for going through and reliving some of these embodied experiences with us, because it is a hard and heavy experience to live through.
Yeah, amazing.
Leave us a 5-star review.
Please leave us a 5-star review. If you do, let us know. You can DM us on Instagram. You can email us. We have all of our contact info in the show notes. We're at Vibes Revealed, vibesrevealedpodcast@gmail.com. And if you let us know that you left a 5-star review, we will send you a remedy revealed.
People are loving remedies revealed, y'all. It's serious. Like, at this point, we have 3. This is episode 4. By, the end of a week, you'll have a full-blown way to boot camp your spiritual experience. And there's embodiment cues, and there's homework and practices that you can do. There's recipes. So it's kind of like a way to just tune in fully to yourself, to your intuition, to your tarot journey.
Yes. Yes. So fun. Okay. Well, I think that's all for us. We will talk to you next week.
We will see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.
Yes. Okay. Love you.
Bye.